All right. Hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I'm so pleased that you've joined me today for the show. My Life as a Landlord is an international landlording podcast, and today we are getting ever more international. I am in New Zealand, and I'm talking with a former Canadian. Ironically, she's from where our Canadian life is based in British Columbia, and she actually grew up with our daughter. My guest today is originally from Powell River, BC, but met and married a Kiwi. She ended up in Auckland, New Zealand, which is where we are today. Amazing. Here to help me compare housing standards between Canada and New Zealand and beyond, welcome Makayla Edwards-Russell. Hi, Makayla.
Hi, thank you so much
Hi.
for having me on. It's really cool, as you were saying, we have like quite a niche connection, I feel like Powell River is such a small corner of the world, but that's where I'm from and obviously grew up with other Jen, and here we are.
I love it. I love it. So tell us the story. Like you're in Auckland. You've met this guy. You're now married. Congratulations. I think you're a year in. My
Yeah.
question is, how on earth did this happen? How did you go from Paul River to Auckland?
Yeah, I know. It's actually quite a spontaneous story. And if you ask my parents, I think they were thinking like, what is wrong with her? But yeah, I met my partner when I was living in Victoria, BC, and he was there on a brief sort of excursion with he used to be in the Royal New Zealand Navy, and they had a ship there for a while. And obviously, then the pandemic happened back in 2020. And he was like, you know what? I've got to move back to New Zealand. Do you want to come with me? And I was like, sure, why not? I guess, I'm not doing anything. I'm sitting in my apartment in lockdown. So sure. And there we went.
There you go. And here you are happily ever after. That's amazing. What are you doing now in Auckland?
Yeah, so I like when I was living in Canada, I always was working in the financial space. So I spent a long time at Bank of Montreal. I was a financial advisor there, left there, and then I moved to a company called Quadreal, which does a lot of larger finance for like malls and big developments in America and larger cities in Canada. So naturally, when I came over to New Zealand, I got right back into the finance slash property space. And I've been worked for a non-bank lender for a little bit, but now I am very comfortably sitting at Lighthouse Financial. So we are kind of like a powerhouse for financial services. We do mortgages, we do investments, accounting, anything property related you could think of. And we also have our own podcast called Checks and Balances, which I'm a part of as well. So it's been a really interesting journey doing that all in a new country.
Yeah, how did that all work? I mean, immigration wise, because your husband is New Zealand, but you're connected. Like, did you have to apply for landed immigrant status? Like, how did that work?
Yeah. It was actually, I feel like it was probably a bit more complex than it normally would be for someone because we were in the pandemic. So
Mm.
originally, I started with a working holiday visa, but when they shut the borders, they weren't letting anyone in unless you were a resident anymore. So we actually had to make a plea to the government to please let me in anyways because of the fact he was a government employee and I was coming with him. So very thankfully, they approved that as an exception. And shortly after we got to New Zealand, I then qualified. We'd been in a relationship long enough that I could say I was a partner of a citizen, which meant I could get a regular working visa, which had much less restrictions. And then I believe it was not much longer after that, I qualified for residency through partnership as well. So it was a bit tricky in the beginning, but coming in with a partner, it's much easier than it is if you're just solo.
And is that your status today? Is that you've got a working visa, or now you've married
Yeah,
a
so
New
I'm
Zealander?
a permanent
Are
resident
you a New
now, and I'm
Zealander
actually
too and a Canuck?
eligible.
Like,
Oh, I'm a permanent resident now, and I'm actually eligible for citizenship in about 1 year's time. So I'm very excited about that.
fantastic. Well, that's pretty cool. Well, you know that I started as a landlord in Powell River, and now we're landlords in Powell River and in Hawaii. And we're expanding our reach through our podcast. And let's talk a little bit more about New Zealand's take on housing. When you and I had talked about New Zealand and talked about our podcast, you had mentioned, oh, New Zealand is quite new at housing. That's an interesting statement. Tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, so I think, in general, actually, New Zealand is quite a new country. If you think about like how a lot of countries have been, they had their industrial revolution, they've been going for years and years. If we think about like I don't know, Europe, Britain, America. But we're actually quite young and we're still kind of figuring things out. But in terms of our housing market, I'd say it's like very rapidly evolving. They're changing regulations all the time. There's, every year or so, there's massive changes in tenancy laws. Because because New Zealand is so small, we also have quite a bit of a housing crisis a lot of the times, and that can look like different things, but most of the time it's to do with demand versus supply. There's just not enough houses for people. And because of that, the government is constantly having to keep in mind, ways to make sure that the houses people do have access to are healthy houses, that there is affordable housing, and that, it goes both ways. So I'd say new at housing might not be the right term, but it's a very evolving market.
Wow. Well, I think that's true. There's lots of places on the planet right now that are in a housing crunch, housing crisis. They may not be changing tenancy laws as fast as New Zealand, but I think that the demand is there. And I think you make a great point about making sure that the housing stock that is available remains healthy. There's a lot of people that we would call slumlords. Mike and I are not slumlords. We only provide units that we personally would live in, and that's our
Yeah.
standard. We live in this. And the answer is yes, because that's how we do it. So, but tell me, before you left Canada, how much experience did you have in BC as a renter or around rentals? I don't have any idea of what your,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I did rent when I lived in BC. I owned a house very briefly for a while, but that was, shortly before I left to New Zealand. But in terms of like being a tenant in BC, I never really experienced much difficulties with landlords. And I don't know if that's just because I'm just like the perfect tenant or what, but I definitely have heard some horror stories from like friends or in certain Facebook groups about landlords trying to keep their bond or landlords not fixing things. I actually saw one friend post on Facebook the other day about how she's renting a basement suite in Victoria, BC. And the wall is so thin that the person that rents the other side of the basement, she can literally hear her speaking through the wall. And everyone was like, that doesn't sound like a legal suite.
No,
But I
my
never had to deal with anything like that, thankfully.
Oh my goodness. Well, one of the things, Makayla, you and I've talked about a little bit is just going, especially since you've changed locations and Mike and I are traveling and we're changing locations daily, that it seems that there's a lot of real estate investors that get used to a certain set of rules in a certain area. And then when they change or they're looking at rentals in a different place, or like you moved to New Zealand, everybody instantly keeps the same set of rules. And if we do nothing else in this episode is to let people know that the rules are not the same. They
Yeah.
different and they're constantly evolving. As you said, they're constantly evolving. And so I have to sort of put in a disclaimer here and go, even though you and I are talking about how it is now, we're going to talk more about New Zealand. In 6 months or a year from now, it could be completely different. So I really hope that our listeners out there are understanding that no matter where they are, don't make the assumption that the rules are the same everywhere, because they're not.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
true.
So let's see. So what I'd like to do with today's episode, compare and contrast tenancy, tenancy at the start, tenancy during the rental aspect, and then as people are ending their tenancy, and just sort of walk us through a bit of this stuff. And you and I can talk back and forth. I've done some brushing up on how New Zealand does stuff, but again, I have no firsthand knowledge on New Zealand. You've been here a heck of a lot longer than I have. And of course, you've seen the BC side as I have. So
Mhm.
interesting conversation. But what are some of the biggest things that you notice how New Zealand approaches rentals in general?
Yeah, I think, you know what, the biggest thing I noticed when I moved over here, and as a caveat, I've actually never rented myself in New Zealand. But one of the biggest things I noticed was that rent is paid weekly here. It's very, very seldom paid monthly. And I found that quite interesting because I wonder if that works better for tenants or if it actually works worse. Because on one hand, you don't have that whole month to save up for your your rental amount, but on the other hand, it's coming out in much smaller increments. So I did find that quite interesting. And I don't know, I'm not familiar with the states, but I'm pretty sure that it'd be monthly as well there, right?
Yeah, pretty much for the most part, it is
Yeah.
monthly. In
Yeah,
a
quite.
few situations, it would be weekly, but mostly it's monthly.
Yeah, quite standard. And then another one I mentioned that I found like quite common here is the use of property managers compared to at least BC. I don't know many of my clients that are investors that don't utilize a property manager. It's pretty much all the time. And again, I don't know if it's like that common in the US, but compared to BC, most of the time when I rented, I was just dealing directly with the landlord themselves.
Mm-hmm. Self-managing seems to be more common, and you're saying that that's not what you're finding in New Zealand. Okay.
Yes, it's there's so many property management companies, especially in Auckland. Like they're just everywhere. And yeah, most people are using someone to manage their rental. So things are going through the property manager most of the time and not just straight to the landlord, which is probably a lot nicer for the landlords because it keeps a little separation there.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, things that I always look at when I'm looking at new locations for tenancy, which of course I'm looking at way more location specific tenancies coming up here in the podcast. But for New Zealand, I just Googled housing. No, what did I Google? Tenancy laws, New Zealand. That's typically what I found. And then tenancy services by the government of New Zealand, the website popped up. So it was www.tenancy.govt.nz,
Mm-hmm.
tenancy.government.nz. And that great website. And it answered a bunch of questions. The biggest question I always ask, because it's such a different aspect, is there a third party when something goes wrong? Is there a third party arbitrator or not? And like in Alberta, if there's a problem, you go straight to court. That's the way it is in Hawaii as well.
Oh, really?
No third party arbitrator. They've tried to inject mediation requirements and things like that. In British Columbia, there is a residential tenancy branch that will help dispel disputes and provide forms. New Zealand is the same way. It's very similar to BC in that way. Tenancy tribunal, and so they have this third party tenancy, which is interesting how this works. But um, let's go kind of walk through a tenancy, starting a tenancy. New Zealand looks like they require the basics, just like most places where you have to have a written tenancy agreement, contact information. You got to split who's paying for what, when. I had no idea that the rent was way more prevalent being paid weekly. That's new to me.
Yeah.
And I see lots of standard forms, which is great because not all places have standard forms. BC and Ontario do. There's some places in the States that do. But you mentioned a term. Let's talk about some of these unique terms. There is something called a bond, and then there's another term in there we can talk about called key money. But let's start with bonds. What on earth do you
Yeah.
the
So
bond?
bond is basically it's just a security deposit.
There,
It's the same thing. I'd say one of the differences though, because when you talked about us having tenancy services similar to BC and having that third party, they actually come in a lot of areas to the tenancy, not just support if there's an issue. So with the bond, which is just the security deposit, that actually gets held with the tenancy services, not in the landlord's bank account. So the landlord has to lodge the bond with tenancy services. And at the end of the tenancy, which I'm sure we'll talk about end of tenancy stuff, it's on the tenancy services to refund that back to, the tenant or decide if, actually the landlord said this, this, and this, and we agree that you should get half or you should get none or whatever it is. And I find that quite good because that's something I'd heard about lots in BC is landlords being like, oh, there's a scuff in the corner of the wall, and so I'm keeping your whole $1,000, So I feel like that's quite good. But the other one you mentioned, key money.
yeah.
Yeah, so key money is actually I can't think of a term to compare this to in BC housing, but it's basically like an illegal payment that they may try and get out of you as like if you give me this under the table, then I'll give you XYZ. The only thing I could think of to compare it to when I was thinking about this was sometimes when it's hard to get a pet into a rental, and you may go, oh well, I'll give you an extra like $1,000 on the side if you let me have my pet, and it's not like a registered extra pet deposit, it's kind of like a bribe on the side. So
Right.
that's what the term key money refers to. It's actually like an illegal payment from the tenant to the landlord.
Now I have to tell you, in New Zealand, key money is not legal. And I would argue that it's not legal in lots of other respects, but in other locations, like I know you recently traveled to Japan. Guess what?
Mm,
Japan, key money is almost expected. Thousands of dollars
interesting.
pays to the landlord for the privilege to rent the place that has nothing to do with rent. It's not a deposit or a bond. It's nothing. It's just
Oh,
so it's really interesting around the world how this term is viewed. Really interesting. The bond, the whole idea of the bond, and then having to lodge it there. I mean, it's the same in most places that I have found in the States and in British Columbia, is that the landlord holds the security deposit in a separate account. So it can't be the operating account. It's the same thing in Hawaii, but there's nothing, as you say, it's nothing remitted to the government. The government doesn't hold it. The landlord is supposed to hold it, which is part of the problem, as you mentioned.
yeah.
But yeah, they're saying you got to lodge the bond digitally in New Zealand. And so that's what that meant, because I didn't understand that. I'm reading this going, what? I'm like, okay, I get the bond, I get a security deposit, but lodging the bond, that's what that means, right? Basically,
Yeah.
the landlord's remitting that money and saying, hey, I'm renting my unit. Here's the bond amount. Here's this money. Okay, got it. Now I got it.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. So basically, like the within 23 days of the landlord starting the tenancy, they need to fill out all the paperwork with tenancy services, and they need to lodge the bond with the tenancy services for it to be valid legal, basically.
give them the money. I gotcha. Well, I was really interested in going in on the website tenancy.government.nz, learning about how tenancy works in New Zealand, especially with the comments that you and I had discussed. One of the things I was most interested in is that the availability of market rent rates on that
Mm,
based on the location. This is one of the problems that most landlords I'm finding in North America in general will get on social media and go, how much do I charge for my unit? I have no idea what my unit is worth. This actually helps landlords a bit. I don't know if this is anything that you ever use, but have you ever
I
had?
actually use this all the time. So because I deal with it, like I don't know if I've explained that I work in like the mortgage space. So I'm doing applications for people to purchase properties a lot of the time. And one of the key things is if someone comes to me and they go, I want pre-approval because I want to purchase an investment property. And, okay, we figured out your maximum purchase price is $900,000 and you're planning to purchase in Auckland, let's say. Well,
Sure.
then you go, okay, but how much rent is that going to generate? Because we want to include that in the application to the bank so we can show, what the future expected income is. Enter the market rent calculator. I can go, okay, well, reasonably, if their budget is $900,000, it's in Auckland, that's probably a 2 to 3 bedroom house. I can go in the market rent calculator. I can go, here's the suburb or here's the city. This is the amount of bedrooms, and it will spit out an estimate of what that rent looks like. And for me, I always take the lower end of the estimate, but oftentimes in reality, it's the higher end. But yeah, I use it all the time. It's super handy.
That that's so helpful. I wish that we had something a little more user friendly like that in locations in both Canada and the US. Unless you're really deep in the numbers, which I am because I'm a great big nerd. Um, but so I can actually go into the research statistics. But as you know, if the government is providing this stuff based on research statistics, it's super handy. I wish we had this kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think
Um,
it's handy for tenants as well because like we have a bit of a different rules around like when you can and can't increase rents and how much you can. And actually, there's been some changes to those in the last couple of years. So I can't quite remember where we're at right now, like with percentage wise, but it's a helpful tool for new tenants as well, because they can use that to kind of negotiate or call out their landlord if they've gone too far, you know?
Right, right. No, it makes sense. It makes sense. Well, let's keep going with, just some of the questions that I've got for you as we progress through a bit of a tenancy. But in the written lease agreement, it's pretty specific. It would include things like water, utilities, wastewater, insurance. And then, in BC, we have to be really specific about things like snow removal. I don't know how
Yeah.
specific. Do you guys get snow in New Zealand?
I mean, of course we do down in the South Island, but most of the North Island is not getting snow, especially not in Auckland. And as you go even further north, definitely no snow here. But I do see, sometimes tenancy agreements including lawn mowing, because I find a lot of landlords they don't want to see the front of the berm looking like an absolute rat's nest just because the tenant can't be bothered to mow. So I'll see them write it into the agreement that, there's a service that will come, or even our neighbor, actually, the house next door to us is a rental, and the landlord comes and does it himself. And I'm sure he charges it in the agreement, but maybe that's our version of snow removal, is the grass removal. But
Awesome.
yeah, in terms of other things written into the agreements, it's actually most of the time the tenant is always covering the utilities like wastewater, internet, anything like that. I think when I was in BC, I sometimes had agreements that had the like heating and water included as just like a set cost. But here it's most common that you're just paying your rent and then you register yourself for whatever services you need.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, let's talk about some of the other expenses as well that come with it. Things like property taxes and specifically tenant insurance. The landlord pays for property insurance, which I think is pretty standard because that goes with the property itself. But in BC, tenant insurance that pays for the tenant's belongings is sort of suggested. So it's the same thing in Hawaii. What about New Zealand? Is that mandatory tenant insurance?
Not mandatory, and I wouldn't even say it's really suggested, but
Hmm.
I do feel it should be strongly suggested, because I don't know if you know, but I think we may have talked about it, but we had some really bad flooding in Auckland it was in January 2023. And for a lot of people, like they lost all of their belongings. And it's bad enough if you own the house and the belongings in it, but even if you just own those belongings, if there's no insurance, like you're not getting any of that back. And it hit a lot of people really hard. So I do hope that after events like that, people are considering their own contents insurance or tenants insurance more seriously, but it's
Mhm.
not something that gets widely like pushed out like you need this.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I really strongly suggest it in BC. Sometimes the renters will get it themselves, but sometimes they won't. And I just, yeah, take it as
I
you
mean,
take it
it's
as you.
their decision, I suppose. I don't think I
Yeah.
ever had any contents insurance when I was renting in BC. And then now that I'm more in the space and I own my own home, I think about it so much and I'm like, oh, you're so lucky you never had any type of like incident.
No kidding. Well, what about maintenance? Maintenance and inspections are always an ongoing issue during rentals. I mean, this is something that we're constantly doing, is making sure that things are maintained. We inspect quite a bit. There's, other things like exterminators that have to go through periodically. Um, Ever experience any of this in BC before you left, or even, you see this stuff in New Zealand? Maintenance and inspections. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, when I was renting in BC, I most landlords I had were quite quite casual. And I don't think I ever really had an ongoing inspection because also, like I said, I never rented in a place that had a property manager either. And most of the time when it was just a singular person, they can't actually be bothered. If it seems like you're decent enough, I don't think they care. But over here, in terms of when you're allowed to inspect, it's pretty much once every 4 weeks that a landlord's allowed to be like, yeah, I'm coming around to pop in. And it's that standard notice period, 48 hours, if you want someone to come by and do work, whether it's the landlord or a tradesperson. So I do find, at least with a lot of my clients, they want to make sure that their units are in like good condition, so they're pretty diligent about doing those inspections.
Mhm. Excellent, excellent. Well, look, in preparing for today's podcast, I went back to tenancy.government.nz, and I was absolutely floored. This is my arena, is landlording in all these different places, and I was amazed at how many forms. And there's actually something on the New Zealand tenancy website called Healthy Home Standard Toolkits for both
Yeah.
tenants and landlords. I'm shocked at how amazing and how well set up this was. I thought, man, this is the kind of stuff that BC needs to take up, well, and even Hawaii as well. It's amazing how much we're learning on this. So even though New Zealand seems to be new to this space, they seem to be doing a few things right. But let me ask you a couple more questions about shifting. There's always this question in basically in any jurisdiction that when you have like a month-to-month lease or what's known as a periodic lease, things can happen pretty quickly. Or then you have like a fixed term lease, which is typically 6 months or a year, maybe even 2 years. But what happens at the end of that fixed term? In Hawaii, it ends immediately. Like there's no, like you're on day zero, like whatever the end of it, it's like that is expected for you to move out. It doesn't automatically convert. BC automatically converts to a month-to-month periodic lease. Do you know how it is in New Zealand?
Yeah, so it's actually the same as BC. If once the fixed term lease ends, it goes month to month unless the, parties agree to renew or actually just end it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, as long as the landlord doesn't immediately go to you, actually you're out, then it just keeps going month to month, which actually causes an interesting issue for me sometimes from the mortgage side of things because a lot of Kiwis are of the mind, I think, if you've got a good tenant, don't let them go. So occasionally I'll be like, right, I need to verify this rental income for your application. Can I see the tenancy agreement? And they send me a document that was signed in like 2017 and expired in 2018. And there's nothing since then because the person's just, been living there, having a great time. And so I've got to get them to prepare something that shows the person actually still lives there. But
Oh.
yeah, I converts to month, but I think for a lot of people, they're really happy to have people stay long term. I don't see quite that. When I was in BC, I felt like there was a lot of drive from landlords to get someone out and get someone in so that they could increase the rent past the actual like allowable amount for the same tenant. And I don't
Mhm.
really see that as much here. Yeah.
Well, and I that might be one of the reasons why, having helpful tools like the market rate rent in all these different locations so that everybody's aware what market rate should be. And so I think that's one of the issues with, like BC rentals when they're trying to get long-term tenants to depart, even if they, especially if they're having a hard time with them, or maybe there's a maintenance issue or something, and then they can fix that and then jump the rent back up to market rate, especially with raising interest rates, insurance rates, cost of property taxes, all these things, everything's going up, up, up. I think that some of the tools that New Zealand is offering is actually really helpful. Yeah, I mean, geez, let's see.
Yeah. I think I going back to, you brought up a couple moments ago the healthy homes thing and how we have so many forms pertaining to that. It's in New Zealand, a lot of the properties are very old and we have a really warm climate here. So they were never originally built for insulation and warmth because it was just warm all the time. And I think with, global warming and all that, things have cooled down here a little bit. So there's a lot of houses that are actually quite cold in the winter, even though compared to Canada, we don't get nearly as cold. But there's that damp moisture that sticks around in these houses without insulation. So there's a massive focus on making sure that landlords are keeping their houses to hitting what are called healthy home standards as well, to make sure that the tenants are, comfortable and then want to stay long term, because you're not going to stay somewhere if you keep getting pneumonia because of the mold.
Right. Makes total sense. Makes total sense. Well, Makayla, let's shift into end of tenancy items for New Zealand. And so you had mentioned before about charging the bond. That just means that there's an expense that a landlord could go back to the government and say, hey, there was this damage, and then the government makes that call, right?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of a sort of like tenancy tribunal in BC. Like if the landlord was going to say, actually, I want to keep some or all of this, they'd
Mm-hmm.
need to explain their reasons, and the tenant would have to have their say. But it's actually almost quite similar to taking it all the way to that decision, but without having the intense, like, no, I said this, she said this. That's just always how it is. So you're going through that process every time, which I think is quite good because, like you said, it keeps it very transparent.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, reading through, I did quite a bit of research on New Zealand stuff. Not that I've ever experienced it, but I found it just fascinating because I nerded out on all this. I totally did. Amazed that New Zealand has quite a few automatic ways to end tenancy based on safety. Is this really, like, they're talking about family violence, they're talking about physical assault, that the tenant could
Yeah.
tenant assault someone else or assaults the landlord? Like, is this really, like, are you guys this violent?
Well, unfortunately, New Zealand does have quite a large domestic abuse problem, which is
Mm.
why the government is really diligent about writing these things in. So yeah, like you touched on, if someone's experiencing domestic violence in their own home, that's completely grounds for them to end the tenancy immediately. There's none of this like, oh, well, sorry, you have to see the lease out because your names are both on it, or whatever that is. And the same thing, like, it doesn't have to be just like a couple. If you've got a flatmate that's become completely unhinged, that's completely grounds to evict the flatmate. I think it's really good, to have those options that's people's safety, right? Like, and that kind of stuff can change in 24 hours. You might need someone out because of XYZ reason. So it's good that the tenancy services and the government recognizes that those are problems here and that they have things in place to deal with them.
Yeah, I'm just I read a lot about police reports. So as a landlord, if I'm a landlord in New Zealand and something happens in the unit regarding safety, if the tenant comes with a police report saying this happened, I need out, like for example,
Mm.
family violence, they 2 days written notice that they can depart immediately. I mean, the physical assault aspect, that if the tenant physically assaults someone, including the landlord, 14
Mhm.
days. I mean, this, I was really kind of shocked, but it all goes back to that police report. That's amazing. Now let's talk about something else. You had mentioned that there was something changing in New Zealand because of strange events that you had learned about. There was a landlord there that couldn't evict the person, and the changes that
Yeah.
were, like, there was a loophole. Tell us that
Yeah,
story.
so there was a quite recent change to the tenancy rules, and I didn't quite write this down exactly, so nobody quote me on this. But it used to be quite difficult actually to evict someone without like a just cause. So recently they've changed something where you can give 90 days notice in like certain situations that aren't cut and dry, like the violence or things like that. But
Hmm.
I did have a story from one of our clients last year, which I was telling you about. We had a client who had an investment property and he had a tenant. Tenant was good. He'd been there a long time. he noticed the tenant hadn't paid rent in quite a while. So he's like, I wonder what's going on. And he comes to find out that actually his tenant's been sent to prison. So he hasn't been living there. He's been properly sent away. He's in the cell and he's not coming back. Now, the thing with this was there wasn't any specific thing he could refer to for like, I know he's gone and he's not coming back, so surely I can get another tenant in. And basically, I mean, of course, he was able to end the tenancy in the end, but I think it took him a few months to work through with the tenancy services what he actually could do, because there was, the fact of unpaid rent. You have to wait, I think it's 21 days after rent has not been paid before you can inquire about it. And then there's the eviction process. But there was also the factor that the tenant had left behind like literally everything he owned in the house. So then you also are stuck with the policies around abandoned goods and how long you have to hold on to them for, and then what you can do with them. So it was quite an ordeal, and I think he lost out on about 3 months of rent in the end, which he unfortunately, like, there's no way to get that back aside from keeping the bond, but that's not going to be enough.
Goodness. Well, Makayla, as we wind down the episode, I'm so grateful to have your perspective for not only in BC, but also New Zealand. I love to hear your story. And truth be told, we did go to lunch in person, and Mike and I had a great time,
Yeah,
right in downtown Auckland. That was wonderful.
it was a good day for it.
Wonderful day for it. It was fantastic. If someone in New Zealand is listening to this podcast and they just have no idea to where to go to for help, what should they do?
Yeah, so my favorite resources are, obviously, we've talked heaps about tenancy services. So the website there is a really great resource for housing, but even property ownership stuff as well. And then my other favorite resource, which I think helps also for people that are looking to purchase. So if you're listening to this and you're like, maybe you live in New Zealand, I don't know, and you're thinking about buying an investment property with a tenant, the website settled.gov is a great resource for just the process and what your rights are, and rent, income, settlements, all that kind of stuff. Both really great. But I also have to plug our own podcast, Checks and Balances, as another really great resource. We talk heaps about anything investment property related, also owner occupied in New Zealand. So if you're listening and you're in New Zealand, please come listen to us too.
Perfect. Tell us again the name of your podcast, Checks and Balances.
That's Checks and Balances. Yeah. And you can listen to that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, pretty much anywhere you can listen to a podcast. YouTube, it's there.
Perfect. If a listener is interested in contacting you, how would they get a hold of you, Makayla?
Probably best is our website, which is just lighthousefinancial.co.nz. There's heaps of resources there as well, and inquiry forms to get a hold of anyone in our team.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you, Makayla, for joining me today in comparing and contrasting New Zealand housing with Canada and beyond. Any parting thoughts?
My parting thought is not going to be landlord related or property related. It's actually just going to be, if you are in Canada or anywhere in the world and you're feeling a little bit stagnant, take a leap. It can work out. See another country, start a new life. It's a great idea. I highly recommend.
Oh, so fun. So fun. Hang on just a sec. Let me just stop the recording.